Hi, everybody. Welcome to episode 140 of the Minnesota Outdoor Skills and Stewardship Series. My name is Jeff Letterman. I work in Fish and Wildlife Outreach at the Minnesota DNR. And we're really excited to have you here with us today. This is our 140th episode, and we'll be talking about emerald ash borer. Our guest today is Rachael Dube. She's a DNR forestry health specialist based out of Brainerd and works in our forestry division. Really excited to have you here today, Rachael. It's actually in some ways a challenging and depressing topic to talk about the impacts of emerald ash borer. I know you're going to cover that, but I live in Woodbury, and it's really, really sad. The number of trees that we've lost here in the East Metro, especially right in my community where I live. But I'm glad you're here to tell us more about that situation. And there are things we can do, right? So help us be good stewards of our forests. So welcome.
Hey, that's right, Jeff. And thanks very much for having me today. I'm really glad to be here. And as you mentioned, I'm going to be talking about emerald ash borer and its impacts to Minnesota's forests. And just like you, Jeff, I'm sure there are folks out here that are currently being impacted by this invasive insect. And there are others like me and Brainerd who are kind of waiting for it to come knocking on our door and are very worried about it. So that's exactly right. I'm here today to help equip you with some helpful information, talk about this insect, and talk about some things that you can do to respond to it and to prepare for it. So with that, if my slides will advance. Let's see, now we're freezing already. There we go. All right, perfect. So this will be an overview of what I'll be talking about today. I'm going to provide an overview about emerald ash borer just to get us all on the same page. I'll also be talking about its biology as well as how to identify it. We'll be talking about its impacts to our forests, both community and urban forests, as well as our rural forests. I'll be talking about how to control emerald ash borer, provide some ash management resources, and then we'll wrap up and I'll share how to report emerald ash borer if you think you're seeing it. So to start off, as you can see, it's a really beautiful insect, a small insect causing really big problems. And as I mentioned, it's an invasive insect that really unfortunately has killed millions of ash trees, both in the US and in Canada. This beetle is only 3/8 to an inch long, and it's got this beautiful metallic emerald green color that really makes it stand out. But that is actually not the life stage that causes problems for ash trees. It's larva, and there's kind of a cartoon of it in this photo. It's kind of this elongated cream-colored larva, and it makes tunnels as it feeds underneath the bark. And these tunnels and feeding activity actually disrupts the tree's ability to transport water and nutrients. So it essentially starves the tree slowly over time. And unfortunately, all of our ash trees that are native to Minnesota are capable of being killed by emerald ash borer, and they're all highly susceptible. We actually sadly expect over 99% mortality over time. And emerald ash borer has actually been such a big problem in a lot of places because ash is a very, very common urban and residential tree. It was actually really commonly planted after a lot of our street elms were taken out by Dutch elm disease. And due to the prevalence of ash trees in our urban forests, we actually predict that EAB will cost municipalities $30 million per year through 2050 just for street tree removal and replacement costs alone. So it's going to have a big economic impact, and it already is in some places. And then where we're losing our ash trees in cities, we're seeing pretty major environmental costs. We're seeing greater cooling costs, lost ability to capture stormwater runoff, as well as loss of our ability to remove air pollution with these ash trees. In addition to that, trees that are killed by emerald ash borer actually dry out very quickly and become quite brittle. So they are actually quite dangerous. and are hazardous to both people and property. I actually found a really sad report from Detroit from 2018 saying that 5 people were killed that year alone by falling ash limbs and trees. So it is a really big problem. And then in our rural forests and woodlands, ash is a really important component of mixed upland hardwood forests. But there are actually several species of ash that play a really important role in wetlands and along bodies of water. And in those wet areas, these ash trees can actually be the dominant species. And so EAB outbreaks moving through those areas can completely remove the forest cover and greatly alter these forest ecosystems. You can see here in this photo how much EAB has changed this landscape. And unfortunately, Minnesota forests uniquely stand to be significantly affected by emerald ash borer because we have a lot of ash trees. Am I depressing you enough yet? Don't worry, I'll share more proactive steps later. But we do in fact have 1 million acres of ash-dominated forests, and this is more than any other state. This map shows the abundance of ash trees in our forests. You can see a lot in central and northern Minnesota. And then these points across the state show the abundance of ash in our communities. And as you can see that in western Minnesota, we have a lot of ash trees in those communities. And in the state, we estimate we have nearly 1 billion ash trees. And so we do expect EAB to have pretty significant impacts in our state. And I'm going to go through this really quickly. You might be in a place where you're wondering if you have ash trees. This is actually a nice little key that we have on our DNR website, and we're going to pop this link into the chat box so you can copy it. Here are 3 different things you can look at to see if you have an ash tree. This first one is a nice one to look at in the winter to see the branching pattern. And ash trees, as well as a few other species, have branches that go directly across from each other in the stem. So that's what you can look for now. And in the spring, look for these leaflets. And then we do have 3 species that are native to Minnesota: green ash, white ash, and black ash. And they all have different characteristics. So if you take, again, a look at that link, it talks about some different ways you can ID each of those species. So you can see here that white ash is our least common species, and this range map is just general. There is white ash that is in the cities as well as other places, but you're probably not going to find it up in Bemidji, whereas green ash is our species that can be found throughout the state. And while EAB is capable of killing all of our trees, susceptibility does vary by species. You can see here that black ash is our most vulnerable species to emerald ash borer. Green is next in line, and then white ash is below that. And white ash could be considered to have a more intermediate susceptibility to emerald ash borer. While these trees will eventually die from EAB, they can hang on considerably longer than both green ash and black ash. And then for all of these species, emerald ash borer is capable of killing trees as small as 1 inch in diameter. And so it can attack the very small trees in the forest and in our yards. And there is an interesting case with blue ash here. You can see kind of in this yellow line. Blue ash is not native to Minnesota. It's a more eastern US species, and it's a little bit south of us, but studies have found that healthy blue ash trees can actually seem to withstand longer term emerald ash borer attack. There's ongoing research, but what they're finding right now is an observed mortality rate of only about 30 to 40% so far. And then on the bottom here, we have Manchurian ash, which is from the native range of emerald ash borer, and it has a very low susceptibility to EAB. And that's because Manchurian ash has evolved with emerald ash borer, and it has natural defenses against emerald ash borer that our trees just don't have. So in its native range, EAB acts just like the native insects we have here that attack our trees. It preferentially goes after stressed trees. It's not very good at attacking healthy trees, but when it comes over here, our trees just have no defenses against it, even if they're healthy. And so emerald ash borer is native to Asia and the Russian Far East. Here's a photo of its native range. And we suspect that it was introduced in shipping materials such as wooden packing crates or pallets. And it was first detected over in Detroit back in 2002. However, we do think that it probably first arrived back in the 1990s, but it escaped detection, that is, for years. And this is likely because emerald ash borer symptoms take years to show up after attack is first initiated. And of course, EAB just really wasn't on anyone's radar in Michigan at the time. And so in the past, more than 20 years, we humans have unfortunately spread emerald ash borer across most of the eastern US. So without the aid of humans, EAB adults are capable of flying several miles. However, they don't often fly that far. They'll often reattack the same tree they came out of or hop to the neighbor tree. And we find that on average, populations only expand 1 to 2 miles per year on their own. However, people commonly move emerald ash borer over long distances into new places on wood products such as firewood. And we've done a lot of work both in terms of doing outreach and putting in place regulatory actions to try to slow the spread of emerald ash borer, but unfortunately, despite these efforts, emerald ash borer still continuously spreads long distances by people really across the country. So it's a really tricky issue. And if you want to do your part to try to prevent the spread of emerald ash borer, here's some useful information from you. You can use only local firewood or firewood that has been certified by the Minnesota Department of Agriculture and has this logo here on the bundle. This certification means that it has been treated and no invasive insects or diseases lurking inside are still alive. And so if you want to find out more information about, where you can use firewood and more about the certification process, you can click on these links that are in the chat. And this is probably the most important point I can share while this video loads up is slowing the spread of emerald ash borer by not moving wood. If you can remember one thing today, it's to try to not move wood. And so this is a short video showing how emerald ash borer has moved throughout the country. It's loading up here. So as you can see, it started in 2002 in Michigan. By the mid-2000s, it's all over Michigan, moving to other states. Now, coming into 2009, we have our first find in Minnesota in St. Paul. It's moving through southeastern Minnesota. It's all over the Great Lakes region, moving into eastern US. We've got to find out here in Colorado in 2015. By 2020, it has really expanded its range. And now going into 2022, we have this new find here over in Oregon, and you can see in Minnesota, it has spread from southern Minnesota to northern Minnesota. And, let me go back one. I want to go back to this Oregon point here. I just find that very interesting, and it kind of illustrates my point. This is actually an EAB range of expansion of over 1,000 miles that just occurred last year. So it really shows how difficult it is in getting the message out to try to slow the spread via wood movement. And so zooming back into Minnesota, currently there are 45 counties quarantined for emerald ash borer. And this is a map from Department of Agriculture. There's a link to that map here. They have this on their website. And these areas in red are quarantined, meaning that movement of ash wood and all non-coniferous firewood or all hardwood firewood is regulated if it is coming out of these quarantined areas. And they do update this map as new areas with EAB are found. And then these areas in green are considered generally infested by EAB. So you can see here, there's a lot of southeastern Minnesota that is generally infested. And if you have ash trees, any land, or you live in that part of the state, that means that your trees are very likely already affected by emerald ash borer, even if they're not showing visible signs yet. So if you are in these areas or have trees in these areas, it would be a really good idea to start making some decisions about what you're going to do to manage your ash trees. And so now we'll move on and talk about emerald ash borer biology and identification. And I'm going to talk about the life cycle because it relates to some of the things we can look for if we want to try to identify new EAB infestations. So emerald ash borer starts off right as this little tiny egg. Then it moves on again to that most damaging life stage, the larva. And then it moves into this kind of intermediate stage called a pupa, where it's between a young larva and then finally the full grown metallic green adult. And in Minnesota, it takes from anywhere from 1 to 2 years for emerald ash borer to complete this full life cycle. In areas where it's warmer, they may be able to do that more quickly in just 1 year. But in areas where it's colder, say in northern Minnesota, populations are going to be more likely to need 2 years to fully develop. And so with Minnesota having both 1 to 2 year emerald ash borer development, you can see here in this calendar that it actually means that we are at risk of emerald ash borer spread via wood movement all year long, because we always have at any time of year larvae hiding underneath the bark, potentially of infested wood. And if that wood is moved to a new location, emerald ash borer can finish developing. The adults come out now in that new location, and firewood, for example, can hold emerald ash borer for 2 years. And so if you are wondering if you have emerald ash borer, you're worried about it, how do you start looking for it? So we actually rely on woodpeckers to start looking at it for us, and they're a lot better at finding it than we are. So what you'll want to do is take a look at your trees, and now is a great time of year to do that because the leaves are off, and you'll want to take a look at the bark. Take a look at branches in the canopy, 3 to 6 inches in diameter, kind of where the rough bark is transitioning to a smoother bark. And what you want to do is look for signs of woodpecker feeding activity. And what they're doing is they're flaking off the bark, taking a look for emerald ash borer larvae, and it exposes that tan-colored inner bark. You can see that here in some of these pictures, and that's called blonding. Now, I will say that trees can have natural variations in bark color. Sometimes other animals or other processes knock some bark off of the wood. You don't want to rely on blonding all by itself, but what you want to do is also look for, you can see especially in this close-up picture here, the woodpecker holes. They are small, they're dime sized, and they're oval shaped, but that's where the woodpecker is actually going in to feed on an emerald ash borer larva. And I mentioned you'll see it start in the upper canopy. By the time the EAB infestation is moving along in time, you could see this blonding moving all the way down the trunk of the tree to the base. Some trees will have blonding, others will have blonding and bark splits, and some trees will just have bark splits. So they can be pretty subtle looking. It's just a nice crack in the bark. You can see here on the left, they do tend to expand over time. And we have actually found that black ash trees are more likely to have these bark splits versus the blonding. So it can be a little bit harder to see. Binoculars help for both cases. As a tree becomes more damaged by emerald ash borer, you will start to see canopy thinning, loss of leaves, more light coming through, and eventually the tree might start to form epicormic sprouts, these bushy sprouts kind of in the inner parts of the tree and at the base. And these sprouts actually come from dormant buds that are activated by all the new light coming in from that diminished canopy. And it's really a last-ditch effort from the stress tree to try to survive. And these are all of these symptoms together, and this shows how they might progress over time. These are all averages, but generally speaking, in that first year, you are not going to see any symptoms of attack. The second year, you might see very subtle symptoms. And the third year is finally when you might start to see symptoms of emerald ash borer attack. And by the time, and maybe in that fourth year, when you're starting to see visible canopy thinning, your tree might actually die in the next year or two, unfortunately. On average, emerald ash borer takes 5 to 6 years to kill a tree. It can vary if you are in an area where populations are low, or you're in northern Minnesota, it might take a longer time. But if you're in an area with very high emerald ash borer populations, it might happen more quickly than that. And so these timelines really demonstrate the need to try to be proactive and take a look at your trees and try to detect EAB early on. It will give you more time to plan. And these are all signs of emerald ash borer that you can use to confirm its attack. We'll go through each of them. We'll start off with the adult beetles. And so I've shown you a few pictures of here of the adult beetle. Of course, you can see that emerald green color. Here's the size of them, but you actually won't see the adults very often. They're usually in the upper part of the canopy, but they are very distinctive. If you happen to see one with its wing covers open, they do have this very distinctive reddish purple abdomen that really nothing else has here. But there are a number of green or metallic insects that are lookalikes for adult emerald ash borer. Here's some common ones. The number one call we get is about this 6-spotted tiger beetle. It's a really common insect, but you can see here in comparison, it is whiter, and these are more likely going to be skittering around on the ground. They're native and they're actually beneficial insects to have around. But even if you do see an emerald ash borer, it doesn't necessarily mean that that particular tree is attacked unless you see it coming out of your tree. So when emerald ash borer adults are finished developing, they do chew their way out of the tree, and they do have little canoe-shaped bodies. The tops of their bodies are flat. So as they emerge, they create these characteristic D-shaped exit holes. And as you can see here in the picture, they are quite small and hard to see. So while these exit holes are diagnostic for EAB, I wouldn't spend a lot of time looking for them. They're actually going to be more common in the upper parts of the tree or EAB is initiating its attack. And by the time you're seeing those exit holes come down to eye height, your tree is probably going to be in pretty bad shape already. I will also say that there are native insects that have fed on ash trees before emerald ash borer came here. They do create exit holes as well. They'll more commonly be oval or circle shaped though. And pulling up this calendar again, you can expect these emerald ash borer adults to emerge during what we call the active period. And in Minnesota, that's considered from May 1st through September 30th of each year. It might change a little bit depending on where you are in the state and the temperatures, but that's the official time when these adults will be coming out and flying around. And now moving on to those EAB larvae that aren't as charismatic looking. As you can see here, they do have these segmented bodies and they are cream colored. And their size depends on how far they are in their development. They will get up to about 1.5 inches in size, and you will have to pry back the bark to see these. There are a number of native insects that look a lot like these, especially if you're not an entomologist. And so if you find something like this chewing around in your ash tree, what you'll want to take a look at are these two spike-like projections at the end of its body. They can be seen with the naked eye on larger larvae. And if you see something with two of these, not one, but two on ash, that means that you've got emerald ash borer, because nothing else feeding on emerald ash borer will have two. And finally, this is probably the easiest to see in terms of the signs of emerald ash borer, and these are its feeding galleries that are S-shaped. You can see they kind of meander around in that inner bark and wood. And what I kind of do to say, if I see a gallery and I'm wondering if it's from emerald ash borer, I see if I can draw an S on it, and if I can, it's probably emerald ash borer. And what's interesting here is you can see this dead brown larvae hanging from this gallery right here. On black ash trees, the galleries can be a little bit harder to see that S shape in sometimes, but they are there. And you do sometimes find with these bark splits, if enough time passes and they split open, you can see those S-shaped galleries underneath, especially with the aid of binoculars. If you're in an area where you have high emerald ash borer populations and trees are heavily attacked, these insect feeding galleries might be a little bit harder to see. Can't really see the S-shaped galleries, and it can look a little bit more like native insect attack. So that's just something to be aware of. And finally, this is actually an example of a tree that was not attacked by emerald ash borer. You can see it's totally riddled with woodpecker holes, but there really isn't much blonding to speak of. And then when I pried the bark back, you can see that there are no S-shaped galleries. They're really just kind of more of a random pattern. And thank goodness, because this tree was actually in Motley, Minnesota, where we're not known to have EAB. So now that we have some idea of how to identify it, let's talk about some more about how it's impacting our forests. And our forest health team does track EAB damage. We actually use aerial surveys. And since 2016, we've mapped almost 25,000 acres of forest with visible EAB damage. And this is actually likely quite an underestimate. For example, we actually haven't been able to aerial survey a heavily impacted area north of the metro yet. And in this year alone, we mapped about 14,800 acres in Minnesota forests in southeastern Minnesota, visibly attacked by emerald ash borer. And here's a photo from southeastern Minnesota in a mixed hardwood forest where you can see all of the ash have died here, leaving non-ash tree species. And so far, almost all of our notable damage to ash forests have been in the southern part of the state, and much of it occurring in these mixed hardwood forests. However, in wet forests dominated by black ash, which again is our most susceptible species to emerald ash borer attack, we do anticipate there being significant impacts and changes to these forests with EAB invasion, especially as it continues to move and spread into northern Minnesota. According to forest inventory and analysis data, black ash accounts for 76% of all of Minnesota's ash trees that are greater than 5 inches in diameter. So we have a ton of black ash. And with the impact of these forests, what we're seeing happen is this rapid loss of these overstory trees and these wet forests leave these areas susceptible to swamping. Essentially what happens is these wetlands just get wetter as these trees aren't taking up the water anymore. And it really just gets to a tipping point where any tree species can no longer establish. And what we're finding is that these forests become dominated by shrubs and sedge, and then we lose that forest cover. And so without any intervention, Minnesota faces loss of ecosystem function and wildlife habitat provided by these black ash forests. However, in northern Minnesota, we do anticipate EAB invasion probably taking decades to become commonplace in these areas. But we do need to act, and black ash forest management is an area of active research as well as trials by forest management practitioners. And sadly, not only do we stand to lose ecosystem functioning, but black ash is a culturally significant species for many tribal nations as well as First Nations peoples. And black ash can be formed into thin, pliable splints that can be woven into baskets. And weaving baskets made from black ash wood is really an integral part of traditions and the identity of many indigenous families. And there are important spiritual ties to black ash amongst many indigenous people. So losses of this tree on the landscape have been and really will continue to be quite devastating. We are actively looking for trees that could replace black ash in these wet forests. Again, it is current research. There are a lot of case studies happening right now. This is a list of potential species that have shown promise in research. For example, we've got disease-resistant American elm, we've got bur oak, swamp white oak, and hackberry. And if you have black ash forests, this is definitely something to look into. But something to keep in mind is that really at the end of the day, it's most important to try to diversify these forests to improve their resiliency and to be really careful with any forest management to make sure that they don't swamp out. So with controlling EAB itself, we've gotten a lot of questions in regards to how cold is too cold for emerald ash borer, and will cold winter temperatures in northern Minnesota help take care of the problem for us? And so emerald ash borer larvae actually use a really cool mechanism called supercooling. And what they do is they generate chemicals to prevent their bodies from freezing at the normal freezing point. And this is similar to how salty compounds act on winter roads to prevent the ice from, or the water that is, from freezing and becoming ice. And research has found actually that most emerald ash borer larvae are killed when their temperatures hit negative 30 degrees. They can't supercool forever. And while this is great news, and we do find we've had some polar vortexes in recent years, it's helpful, but emerald ash borer populations can reproduce very quickly. So we do find that they can unfortunately rebound after very cold winters. And while we do expect these cold temperatures to help reduce emerald ash borer populations, especially in northern Minnesota, they will not eradicate it from the state, unfortunately. And it really is difficult to predict how a changing climate will affect EAB success in northern Minnesota. Just as an example, I'm sure a lot of you have seen this in the news just in the past week. We updated our USDA plant hardiness zones for Minnesota and across the country, and just in this 10-year change, you can see pretty significant changes in these plant hardiness zones. So this will only serve to help emerald ash borer. And we've also seen in Canada that as these more cold tolerant EAB survive those winters in Canada and reproduce, the population on average actually becomes more cold hardy over time. We do have biocontrol as a tool, and if you're not familiar with what that is, it's what we do to control a pest by introducing a natural enemy or a predator. So that's something that's, if you're controlling an invasive species, bringing in something from where it came from. And it's really our only management option that we can apply at the forest management or the forest landscape level, that is. And it's not a silver bullet for emerald ash borer, but our goal really is to use biocontrol to reduce EAB populations and try to mitigate their damage. And so we have released 3 parasitoid stingless wasp species. They're very tiny in Minnesota, and they're harmless to people. And they've done a lot of rigorous testing to make sure that they don't have any severe impacts to our native species. They're very species specific to emerald ash borer. And it's too early to say exactly what's going to be, the future of all of this in Minnesota. We are monitoring, and we are finding that some of these wasps are naturally reproducing here. But if you've got ash trees in your yard, here are some general recommendations that we can provide for you. A lot of it will be on a case-by-case basis, but in general, we do really encourage you to be proactive and come up with a plan and consider all of your options. If you do have any very high value ash trees, just know that an option for you is to treat them with an insecticide to prevent emerald ash borer infestation. And it's really up to you in terms of how much risk you can live with in terms of when you want to start treating your trees. We generally recommend that you wait until EAB is close by, within a few miles of you. And ideally, you would treat before your tree is infested, but treatments are effective on lightly infested ash. Kind of a general rule of thumb is if the tree has lost no more than a third of its canopy. And on the bottom of the page here, just for time, I can't go into a lot of these insecticides, but Department of Agriculture has put together this really awesome guide on insecticide selection, use, and environmental protection for landowners. So we'll pop that link into the chat. Provides good information about the timing of these insecticides, different options for you, a lot of great information. And I will say that EAB insecticide treatments can be quite costly. So we generally recommend them for, again, those high value yard trees, but you could also treat trees for a period of time to keep them protected to allow you to save up for tree removal costs that can be very significant as well. And so something else you might consider doing is removing any low value ash trees and again, replanting your yard with a diversity of species. Something that I really want to emphasize is not waiting until your trees are dying or dead from emerald ash borer attack. Not only, again, like I mentioned, these trees will be dangerous, but the costs of removing those trees increase significantly as they become more brittle and more dangerous. And finally, again, broken record, but if you do have any EAB infested trees, of course, don't move that infested wood and make the problem that you're dealing with a problem for someone else. Again, moving any infested wood, avoiding that is really the most important thing you can do for ash management. And want to share some great ash management resources that I hope will be helpful for you as well. Here's another helpful document from Minnesota Department of Agriculture. These are some guidelines that they provide that can be used for ash yard trees. And it has a nice decision matrix as well as information on different management strategies and links to other helpful resources. And if you are in the situation where you do have ash waste that you need to dispose of, Department of Agriculture has local site information in terms of where you can dispose of your ash, provides this information for quarantined counties, again, so you can stay in compliance with the quarantine. But if you are outside of that quarantine zone, where you can bring your wood is really going to be dependent on where you are. So I encourage you to familiarize yourself with your local options. And again, if you are moving any wood, just make sure you're following any quarantine regulations. And again, here's the link to that site that we'll put in the chat. Moving into more rural settings, this is a great document from the University of Minnesota Extension. It's managing ash woodlands guidelines for woodland owners that have ash in their woodlands. And here are some general takeaways from this document. Similar to yard trees, is trying to make a plan as soon as possible, know what your goals are, understand how much ash you have and the risk to your forest. We highly encourage you to work with a professional to mitigate EAB impact in your forest. Encourage you to diversify where you can. And if you have a wet ash forest, of course, be really careful not to flood out your forest so you can keep a forest. Here are some examples of some resources. There are others out there, but our Minnesota DNR Forest Stewardship Program has a cost share option for woodland owners. And this is a map that is on our website for local contacts for private forest land foresters. And if you own rural forests, you could be eligible for cost share. There are a variety of activities that you can do under cost share. So if you're interested, check out this website and contact your local PFM forester. Through our community forestry program, we have some DNR administers grants for EAB control. We've offered these in the past through the 2023 Relief Community Forestry Grants Program. We are actually administering additional grants in early 2024 through Minnesota Relief, and this financial assistance will be available to both communities and residents. And it actually is going to be prioritizing nonprofits and local units of government that are looking to mitigate the impacts of emerald ash borer. So if you're interested, check out this website, and here is some contact information for you as well. And then finally, how to report emerald ash borer if you think you're seeing it outside of the generally infested area. So you can contact Minnesota Department of Agriculture, report a pest. They have an online reporting form. We'll include a link to that in the chat. You can email them as well or call. Make sure you take some great pictures if you're going to report it. You can also send a report through this Great Lakes Early Detection Network app, the Glendon app, and you can download that to your form. Again, you send some pictures. And then finally, you can submit an EDD maps report. This will actually send a report directly to Minnesota Department of Agriculture staff. So some takeaways from this presentation. Again, just want to reiterate, I hear from people all the time, I know I shouldn't do it, but I do move firewood sometimes. So really, it's so critical to not move any ash wood. And it also prevents the spread of other invasive insects and diseases as well. And the earlier you can detect EAB, the better. It gives you more time to prepare, and it helps you to spread out the costs of managing EAB and managing that now dead wood you'll have on your hands over time. And then in black ash forest settings, start thinking about diversifying your forests now. And then finally, report EAB or its symptoms if you do see it in a new area. Thank you so much for your time, everyone. Really appreciate it. And I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. That's really great information, and you provided a lot of resources. But if you missed it, folks, Benji's been posting those also in the chat, so you can click on that in the bottom right corner, the three dots, ellipses, and you can pull up the chat and see those and directly link to those resources. We do have a lot of questions, Rachel, and if others still have questions they'd like to ask, you can plop those in. We'll get to as many as we can here in the next 15 minutes or so, but we will start. Amanda asks about mountain ash trees being susceptible.
Yes, okay. I had actually considered talking about them. So mountain ash trees are actually not a true ash, so they will not be attacked by emerald ash borer. Emerald ash borer will only attack ash trees with one exception that we're aware of. It's called the white fringe tree. And to my knowledge, it's an ornamental tree that cannot be planted in Minnesota. I believe it's only planted in the southern US. So mountain ash is safe to plant and a very beautiful tree.
Yes, and great fruit for animals and birds and stuff too.
Yes.
Are we seeing Amber's asking, are we seeing black ash forest being lost to black ash, or were you just speculating about the loss of that balanced ecosystem?
Yeah, so with, I showed on our quarantine map that a section of northern Cass County is now quarantined for emerald ash borer, and that's a detection we actually just made in October. So it's actually just it's an emergency quarantine, and this detection of emerald ash borer in this location is really the first time we have found emerald ash borer infestation in true northern black ash forests in Minnesota. And detecting emerald ash borer, as I mentioned early on, is really difficult, especially in rural areas where there are just fewer eyes on it. And we actually are thinking that that infestation may have been there for 10 years already. And Minnesota Department of Agriculture staff, they are the regulatory authority for emerald ash borer. They're going out and doing official surveys right now to try to determine how big this infestation is. But very sadly, it is happening now. It is our hope that, again, with colder temperatures, outreach, that there will be many decades before large swaths of our black ash forests are affected by emerald ash borer. But if you are in a situation where you own any black ash forest, the time to start managing it is probably yesterday. And really sadly, the costs of trying to manage those forests, they take a lot of babysitting to try to replant. Like I mentioned, they swamp out easily. So the cost and effort level can be high. So we might have to strategically decide where we can manage and where we sadly have to let it go.
Yeah, and as I mentioned earlier at the start of the program, living in Woodbury, we can see from our community forests that, I would consider a lot of our places like Woodbury, lots of trees, a forest, and the impact has been devastating. Right over here on one of our streets near 694, 494, the developer planted a foundational ash tree at every house, and they're all dead. Up and down the street, everybody's got these major trees dead. So we can see the impact is here in the East Metro and probably in southeastern Minnesota is really significant. Kim asked, for biodiversity purposes, can the introduction of more woodpeckers be of assistance?
Yeah, so I am not aware of anyone doing any research on the effects that woodpeckers are having on emerald ash borer populations. We know that they are. And so I would have to probably collaborate with our wildlife folks. It would be really difficult because it's not comparable to these emerald ash borer biocontrol agents that we're releasing, these parasitoid wasps. They specifically attack emerald ash borer, whereas these woodpeckers would attack even our native species. So you could potentially tip the balance. So it's something that we'd have to be really careful with. I know in the world of biocontrol, these sorts of releases take years of advanced preparation to try to mitigate any unforeseen consequences.
Yeah, and of course, woodpeckers have a wide or varied habitat needs, right? And needing nesting cavities and things like that. So the amount of space and having the right nesting and other habitat is would have to be there too. So there are there's a lot to think about. Lots to think about. Eric asked, and this is a really good question. Can I cut firewood from a maple in my yard, and then is that safe to transport?
Yeah, so that is a great question. So it depends on where you're at. With the emerald ash borer quarantined that is administered by Department of Agriculture, if you're in a quarantine zone, it actually does restrict the movement of all hardwood firewood, and that is any wood that has a length of 4 feet or less. And the reason why they decided to regulate all hardwood firewood and not just ash firewood is that once a tree is taken down and cut into segments, it can be really difficult to identify that species. And once you have bundles of wood, it's a really good place for insects to hide in and get transported around. So you would need a compliance agreement to move any firewood outside of a quarantine zone. If you're outside of the quarantine zone, you can legally, freely move that wood around. However, to try to be a good steward of our forest, I highly encourage you to only move it short distances unless, again, it is MDA certified firewood.
Yeah, there's just so many things, right? Pests and diseases that are in trees and stuff that it's just good practice not to move them at all.
That's exactly right. And there are new invasive species that are on the horizon that could do a lot of damage. And a lot of our urban forests are pretty heavily dominated in some areas, or there's a large component of maple, and we'd hate to introduce something that attacks maple into new places.
Yeah. Kim asked if a homeowner can just burn their infected ash tree in their own yard.
Yeah, so I know that in some municipalities there might be rules regarding open burning, so you might want to look into that. But that is, if that isn't an issue for you and you are able to burn on your property, it is best if you can't destroy it in any other way to burn it. That will kill any emerald ash borer larvae. You could also chip it if that's an option. And if you are in the situation where you can't burn, you can't chip, you can't otherwise destroy it, leaving it on site is actually your best fallback option, because then you're not moving populations around to new places. And we do suggest that if you have any EAB infested wood, or you are in a high risk area, if you do need to do any work on your trees, to try to limit it to that non-active zone outside of May 1st through September 30th each year, trying to do it outside of that. And if you're in a situation, say, where there is a hazard tree, if you must move that wood to a disposal site, cover that load, but that would kind of be, your last option. Try to avoid that if at all possible.
You make a really good point about when to manage and trim and work on your trees. And I think it applies to almost all species. It's far better to do that during the non-active period you're talking about in the wintertime. So
Yes.
yeah, just that's a really good point for anyone who's thinking about pruning or trimming or working on their trees, to try to keep that to the cold periods of the year.
That's right.
June, no question, but a comment. Excellent presentation, Rachel. So thank you, June.
That was very sweet of you. Thank you.
Lisa asked, she's heard that treating ash trees is just putting off the inevitable. Is that true?
Yeah, that actually is. I have actually, there's a pretty recent research paper that came out talking about kind of urban myths surrounding emerald ash borer, and they did call that a myth. It is really critical to get the timing right and make sure that you're following the label, that you are, if it is a product that has to be applied by a professional, right, that you are working with someone that is certified. All of those things do have to line up in order to be successful. And just as an example, a common insecticide that is actually injected into ash trees, emamectin benzoate, that, just as an example, is guaranteed to provide 2 years of protection. So if you missed a year, sometimes people do go to 3. If you're in an area with lower EAB populations, that's where you could potentially have misses. And then, of course, with these insecticides, you do have to apply them for the life of the tree. But there are, again, there's research looking into this. There is a thought that, treating some of these trees could provide some sort of associational benefit for any non-treated neighbor ash trees. And there is a benefit there are actually a number of native insects that actually are reliant on ash trees, and there's ongoing work to see if they could potentially use alternate hosts, but those insects are still relying on our ash trees. So if we could keep some of them around, it could be beneficial for them.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about, do you have any numbers on costs? And as you mentioned, there's some trade-offs here, but do you have numbers on estimates about what that costs? And I understand some communities, as part of some of these grants, maybe are providing some discounts, right?
That's right. Yeah. So I have heard that, yeah, sometimes these communities, right, that's kind of doing it on a larger scale, can get discounts. Look into it to see if you're, municipality maybe has received a grant that I didn't mention. They could, help provide some assistance for you. Look into that. I have very basic kind of generalities from what I've heard. I've actually heard this from Department of Agriculture staff, and they've given presentations, and a number I've heard them reference, and I think this again was referencing emamectin benzoate specifically, was $7 to $10 per diameter inch for your tree. So just to make it simple, let's say the cost was $10 and you had a 10-inch diameter, and that's at breast height. That is a forestry term that means at 4.5 feet above the ground. That would be $100 to treat that tree. Now, if that's just one tree, that maybe doesn't sound so bad, but you have to remember you'll want to keep continuing to treat that tree every 2 to 3 years. If you have a number of trees you want to treat, the cost goes up. And then if you have a large tree, and those typically have to be treated by professionals to be successful, those costs can be quite high. So again, it's all about, kind of your own situation and the trade-offs and what you want to do. If you have an ash tree that you really love that provides shade right over your house, maybe that would be one that you would choose to treat rather than take down. Alternatively, you might decide to take that down because you don't want it to get infected by ash and become a hazard, and it's right next to your house. And I touched on this briefly. There is also a strategy, right? If you are removing, especially if it's something that's more difficult to remove, but a big ash tree, the cost could be thousands of dollars to remove that tree. And lots of people just don't have a tree care budget set up for that amount of money. So let's say, you did put several $100s into treating a tree, maybe while you're saving up some money. That could be another option, or if you even just want to buy yourself some time. But I do recognize that it's a really difficult situation, and there are definitely some environmental justice issues at play. And I've read in the news, about people in communities having a really difficult time in managing this EAB killed wood, and it's been a big financial burden for them.
Yeah, you could buy a lot of years treatment with the cost it takes to remove some of these big trees too. So that's one of the trade-offs, right?
Yep, that's right.
Can we touch too on replacement? Is it better to wait to replace, or say you have a tree and you don't have a lot of room in your yard in these suburban city yards, right? So is it okay to start planting the tree underneath that and let it start getting going because you're going to have to replace your ash, or do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. The answer is it depends. So if you did want to grow something underneath the shade of an existing ash tree, you'd want to look for a tree that would be considered low to moderate shade tolerant. And there's lots of great information. Say if you look at the National Arbor Day Foundation, they actually have great information on the characteristics of trees, say the soils they like, et cetera. They can give you information. Some trees really don't grow well if they have any shade above them, like trembling or quaking aspen is an example. Shade intolerant. Butternut, and the state endangered butternut is shade intolerant. They don't tend to do well. But if you want to plant something outside of that, you certainly could get started. And really, your decision to start planting in your yard versus taking the tree down. Again, trees take a long time to grow, so it depends. Do you want to strategically take 1 or 2 down at a time if you have a lot of ash? Do you want to just go full bore? But keep in mind that, right, yard trees provide a lot of benefits, including shading costs, reducing air conditioning costs. So you want to be careful. And if you wanted to get some help with that, I would suggest there's a lot of great resources online. Some of the ones that I mentioned kind of cover some of those different decisions you might want to make. You could also work with a certified through the International Society of Arboriculture, a certified person working in tree care. They could help potentially. They could help you make some of those decisions.
Yeah, and then a lot of communities, and especially in the Twin Cities and our bigger cities, have city foresters. So they're a great resource. They're willing to help, I know, private landowners too. James mentioned that white fringe tree is cold hardy and can be planted in Minnesota, which you referenced earlier. And
I really appreciate that. Thank
yeah,
you.
Jennifer said
Don't plant
great.
it.
Jennifer said great presentation, and she commented that the website, DNR website resource, Best Native Yard Trees for Your Changing Climate, is a really great resource, which I think we have in there. We are out of time. If folks want to connect with you, I know you you shared, I think, your email earlier.
Yes.
So if you have additional questions, you can reach out to Rachel. Really appreciate you being here today. I do want to mention that this is our last fall series webinar, but we have our winter series ready to go. It's already posted on our website again at mndnr.gov/discover. Please check that out. And those of you that have registered for programs are going to get an email very shortly to let you know about our winter series. We're starting out next week with ice adventures. If you've ever been interested in ice boating, ice climbing, and things like that, some of those extreme adventures, we have the people to talk to you next week to give you more information on how to get started, how to find out about it, or learn more about it. And then the week after is Minnesota Owls, especially up at Sax-Zim Bog in northern Minnesota. We have a specialist from there telling us all about the great viewing and things you can learn about owls and see them up there in northern Minnesota. And as always, our programs are recorded. Those videos are available at the DNR YouTube channel and at our website, mndnr.gov/discover. So anything else?
Thanks for everyone for coming today.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks, everyone.
Great presentation. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for being here. Have a great week.